Midnight in Crescent Pines was a peculiar kind of quiet. Not the kind that brings peace, but the kind that makes you feel watched. Rachel lived at the edge of town, in a house too big for her and too empty after her husband's passing. The loneliness was a constant, but tonight it felt heavier, like the shadows in the corners of her living room had grown teeth. She sat on the couch, a mug of cold tea in her hands, staring at her phone. It was always the same routine. Scroll through social media until her eyes got heavy, then drag herself to bed. But tonight, the phone buzzed in her hand. An unknown number flashed on the screen. She hesitated. It was late. Too late for casual calls, but curiosity won. "Hello?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The line crackled, and then a voice came through. Low, raspy, and impossibly close. "Rachel." The voice sent a shiver down Rachel's spine. "Who is this?" she demanded, trying to sound braver than she felt. The line went dead. No reply, just the faint echo of static. Rachel stared at the phone, her heart pounding. A prank call, she thought. Kids messing around. But then her phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a call. It was a text. One word. "Run." Her breath hitched. She looked around the room, the weight of her isolation crashing down. The shadows seemed to creep closer, pressing against the walls. She locked the door, double-checking the latch, then closed the curtains. Her fingers trembled as she blocked the number. "It's nothing," she whispered to herself. "Just a stupid joke." But deep down, she knew better. The hours dragged on. Rachel tried to shake off the unease, but sleep wouldn't come. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, when she heard it. A knock at the front door. 3 slow, deliberate raps. Her stomach tightened. She glanced at the clock. 2:13 a.m. No one should be here. She tiptoed to the window and peeked through the curtains. The porch light flickered, but no one was there. Knock, knock, knock. This time it was louder, more insistent. Rachel's mind raced. Should she call the police? But what would she say? That someone was knocking on her door at 2 a.m.? She grabbed her phone, but before she could dial, the knock stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Rachel didn't sleep that night. She sat in the living room, clutching a kitchen knife, her phone on the table beside her. The knocking didn't return, but the dread lingered like a storm waiting to break. At dawn, she decided to step outside. The air was crisp, the kind of morning that should have felt refreshing, but on her porch, she found something that made her blood run cold. A photograph. It was old, black and white, and in it was her house. But the details were wrong. The windows were shattered, the door hung off its hinges, and standing in the front yard was a figure. Faceless, featureless, but unmistakably watching the house. Scrawled on the back of the photo were 3 words. "Don't open it." Rachel tried to convince herself it was all some elaborate prank, but when night fell again, the knocking returned. This time, it wasn't just at the front door. It was at the windows, the back door, even the walls. A rhythmic, taunting pattern that made her skin crawl. And then came the voice. "Rachel, let me in." It was the same voice from the phone call, but now it was louder, closer. She pressed her hands over her ears, trying to block it out. The walls seemed to tremble, the shadows twisting and stretching. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was deafening, but Rachel knew it wasn't over. She turned to the front door. The locks were undone, though she hadn't touched them. And in the center of the floor, lay another photograph. This one showed her, sitting on the couch, clutching the knife, her face twisted in fear. She hadn't heard the camera. Rachel's breaking point came just before dawn. The knocking had started again, louder and more frantic, and the voice was relentless. "Let me in, Rachel. Let me in." She grabbed the photograph and stormed to the front door. "What do you want?" she screamed, her voice hoarse with terror. The knocking stopped. The voice fell silent. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of her own breathing. Then the door burst open. The figure from the photographs stood there, towering and faceless, its presence consuming the room. It didn't move, but Rachel felt its intent. It wasn't here to hurt her. It was here to take her. The last thing she saw was the figure reaching out, its shadow swallowing the room when the neighbors finally called the police. Rachel was gone. The house was empty, but it didn't feel abandoned. On the coffee table lay the photographs, each one telling a piece of the story. No one ever saw her again. But sometimes late at night, the new owners would hear it. 3 slow knocks, and a voice on the other side of the door, whispering, "Let me in." The clock struck midnight, and the neon lights outside the diner flickered like dying stars. It was quiet, save for the occasional sound of a car driving by on the empty highway. The diner sat on the outskirts of town, where the lights seemed to fade into the darkness of the woods. The night crew was a small group. Ellie, the waitress who had been working the night shift for as long as anyone could remember. Brad, the cook with a gruff demeanor but a kind heart. And Susan, the cashier, who always seemed a little too tired for the world. Ellie wiped down the counter, her fingers tracing the familiar grooves of the wood. The diner had been the same for years: faded booths, cracked vinyl seats, and the ever-present smell of coffee and frying bacon. It was a small-town diner, the kind where time seemed to stand still. "Another slow night," Brad said, flipping a burger on the grill. His voice was rough, but there was a hint of humor in it. The diner had always been empty at this hour, save for the occasional trucker or drifter who needed a quick meal. But tonight was different. The air felt thicker somehow, like something was hanging just out of sight, waiting. At around 1 a.m., the bell above the diner door rang, signaling the arrival of a customer. Ellie looked up from the counter, surprised to see someone. A man, dressed in a long dark coat, stood in the doorway, his face hidden in shadow. He stepped inside slowly, as though he were reluctant to break the silence of the night. The man took a seat at the counter without a word. Ellie hesitated for a moment before approaching him. There was something unsettling about his presence. But she smiled anyway, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling crawling up her spine. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice a little too bright. The man nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. "Yes," he replied softly. "And a slice of pie, Jerry." Ellie poured the coffee, her hands shaking slightly. Something about this man, his stillness, his silence, felt wrong. But she pushed the thought aside. He was just another customer, right? As Ellie set the coffee cup in front of the man, he didn't take his eyes off her. There was something strange about his gaze. Too intense, too knowing, as if he were looking through her rather than at her. "You're Ellie," the man said suddenly, his voice low and smooth. "You've been working here for 6 years." Ellie froze, her hand hovering above the counter. "How do you know that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man smiled, a cold, knowing smile. "I know more about you than you realize," he said, his voice dripping with something darker. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Ellie's heart skipped a beat. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. How did he know that? She'd barely spoken to anyone about the things that had happened in her life. The things she had tried so desperately to forget. Brad and Susan exchanged glances from the kitchen. They had noticed the stranger too, but neither of them spoke. It wasn't until the man turned toward them, his eyes locking onto Brad's, that the silence broke. "You're Brad," the man said, his voice now carrying an eerie familiarity. "You've been running this kitchen for 15 years, haven't you? I've tasted every meal you've ever made." Brad froze, a spatula still in his hand. "What the hell are you talking about?" he muttered. But there was a sinking feeling in his stomach. He had never seen this man before, but somehow the words felt personal. The man smiled again. "You lost someone, didn't you? A long time ago. A sister, maybe? I think you never got over it." Susan, who had been listening in, paled. "Hey, that's enough," she called from the cash register, her voice shaking slightly. She'd been with the diner for 3 years, and she'd never encountered a customer like this. The man turned toward her, his smile widening. "Ah, Susan. You're the newest one here. You're good with numbers, aren't you? But you've got a secret. A big one. You're hiding something, and I'm going to make sure you face it." Ellie, Brad, and Susan exchanged nervous glances. How could this man know so much about them? And why was he speaking with such certainty? As the minutes passed, the man's words grew more disturbing. He spoke of things that none of them had ever shared with anyone else. Private struggles, personal fears, and memories they thought they had buried deep inside. He knew things that no one could have known. "Ellie," the man said, his voice now low and almost a whisper. "You think you left your past behind when you came here, but it's always with you. You can't escape it." Rachel's stomach churned. "Stop. Stop it," she pleaded. The man ignored her, his eyes darkening. "Brad, you thought you could outrun the pain, didn't you? But it follows you wherever you go. And Susan, you've never forgiven yourself for what happened that night, have you? You thought you could bury it all, but I see through it. I see it all." Brad's grip on the spatula tightened. "Who the hell are you?" he shouted, but the man only smiled. "I'm the one who knows," he said simply. "The one who watches, and I've come to make you all face the truth." The diner seemed to grow colder as the man's presence grew stronger. Ellie could feel the weight of his gaze on her, heavy and suffocating. The walls seemed to close in and she couldn't breathe. Suddenly the man's voice echoed in her mind. "You've been running from the truth, Ellie, from your own reflection." Ellie gasped, her hands trembling. She had never told anyone about the accident, the car crash that had taken her brother's life. The guilt had eaten away at her for years. The man was right. "You'll never escape it," he whispered again. "None of you will." And with that, he stood up and walked toward the door. Ellie didn't know how, but she knew. He wasn't leaving. He wasn't real. He was something else entirely. Something from the deepest parts of their own minds. As the man reached the door, he turned and looked back at them one last time. "Remember," he said, his voice echoing, The truth will always find you. And then he was gone. Just like that. The bell above the door rang, and the night was silent again. The diner returned to its quiet stillness, but the three of them knew things would never be the same. The man had left his mark on them, and no matter what they did, they would never forget his words. The night passed uneventfully after the stranger left, but Ellie, Brad, and Susan knew that their lives had changed forever. They didn't speak of it again, but they would never forget the terror they had felt. And every night, when the bell above the door rang, they would wonder if the stranger would return. And if he did, what would he show them next? It was one of those evenings when the world seemed to hold its breath. The kind where the sunset feels a little too perfect, and the air has that faint bite of winter coming on fast. Ethan, a kid who preferred shortcuts and easy answers, decided to take the long way home for once. Silver Pine was a sleepy town, but its woods, they were something else entirely. A tapestry of gold, red, and secrets. The path was narrow, lined with twisted trees that reached for each other like old friends, or maybe enemies. Ethan didn't usually wander into the woods, but that day, he did. He had no idea he was about to walk straight into a story no one would ever believe. The woods were quiet. Too quiet. Every footstep Ethan took seemed to echo back at him, like the forest itself was mocking him. Then he heard it. Another set of footsteps, just a fraction of a second off from his own. He froze. The sound stopped. "It's just my imagination," he muttered, though the words felt hollow. That's when he saw it. A small leather journal lying just off the path. It looked out of place, like it didn't belong here, and that's exactly why he picked it up. The cover was worn, the kind of thing you'd find in a thrift store or buried in an attic. He flipped it open. The first page hit him like a slap. "Do not trust the whispers." Ethan's first instinct was to laugh it off. Whispers? Yeah, right. But as he turned the pages, the laughter dried up. The entries were frantic, messy. Someone had written about voices that came from nowhere, calling their name, promising things that sounded too good to be true. The handwriting got worse the further he read, the words unraveling into nonsense. Then it happened. "Ethan?" The voice was faint, almost tender, but it sent a cold spike straight through him. He spun around, nothing. The forest was just the forest, but it didn't feel right anymore. The trees seemed closer, the shadows darker. And the whispers? They didn't stop. By the time Ethan found the cabin, he was running. The whispers weren't just calling his name anymore. They were taunting him, laughing at him. The clearing opened up like a wound in the forest, and there it was. A sagging, rotting cabin that looked like it'd been abandoned for decades. The journal's last entry screamed in his mind, "If you find the cabin, do not enter." But Ethan wasn't thinking straight. His feet moved before his brain could catch up. The door creaked open, and inside, the air was damp and cold. The walls were covered in strange symbols, jagged and violent, like someone had carved them with a trembling hand. In the center of the room was a chair, old and broken, facing the corner. Ethan didn't want to get closer to the chair, but the whispers were relentless now, pushing him forward. His feet dragged across the creaking floorboards, and then he saw it. The chair wasn't empty. A figure sat slumped forward, its body unnaturally still. It was wrapped in shadows, but its face, or lack of one, was unmistakable, smooth, blank, and when it moved, jerking like a puppet on tangled strings, the whispers grew louder, screaming in his ears. "You should have listened," it rasped. The voice was everywhere, in the walls, the floor, the air. Ethan didn't have time to scream before it lunged. A week later, a group of hikers stumbled across the journal. It was back on the path, its leather cover damp with dew. One of them picked it up, curiosity lighting up her face. She flipped to the last page, her brows furrowing as she read the final entry. "Do not trust the whispers. They lie." In the distance, the wind stirred the trees, and faintly, so faintly, it could have been a trick of the mind, a voice called out, "Ethan,